is a test to try to basically grow as myself and make connections and provide some value and explore some new possibilities.
Loss to risk to volatility. Stress is bad for learning.
It's a good real world experience kind of thing.
I would say that game theory, the science of strategic interaction, is in microeconomics.
Teaching is like a whole nother ball game. Like, that's my point of view.
It gets dangerous when you start assuming what other people's preferences are.
What's up, guys? It's Dan Cates, and today I've got a very special guest. The only poker player I've ever known that's graduated from Harvard. He's also taught at Harvard for 9 years. He's taught behavioral economics and game theory, among other things. In addition, he's an author of 4 books and has been a professional poker player for many years. Brandon Adams, what's going on?
What's up?
Not much. I should tell you, when I was younger, I had a little bit of an aspiration to go to Harvard, but I lacked the grades in particular. And I noticed it actually was very, very difficult. I didn't realize how difficult it was until I actually tried to apply. And it was like, whoa, okay, these guys have some serious resumes. So congratulations, you must have done extraordinary in school and had extracurricular activities and all that stuff. I know you played tennis. I don't know if that had any significance for you're like
Well, I wasn't good at tennis.
Oh, okay.
No, my path was unusual. I took college courses when I was in high school. I took courses at University of West Florida.
Yeah.
And I had a fair number of college credits by the time I graduated high school, like 70 out of 120 needed to graduate.
Yeah.
So when I was going to undergrad, I decided to go to University of Florida because I could finish pretty quickly. I just needed to do an additional 50 credits or whatever. So I actually finished high school in 97 and college in 98 at University of Florida.
Oh, okay.
And then I was young and like my grades were good, but I was not really going to get into a top grad school, and I wasn't quite done with school. I really enjoyed college, and I was kind of thinking about what to do next. So I actually stayed around University of Florida after I graduated and took some grad courses just as a post-bac. It was sort of like I graduated early, but for no point because I wasn't ready to leave. And then I decided that maybe I wanted to go to grad school, and I was kind of looking at different grad schools like MBA programs, doctorate in business programs, and I was realizing that I wasn't going to get in probably based on my University of Florida background. But I was a very bad student in college in the sense that my attendance rate was under 5%. I was very studious. I read a lot of books. I spent a huge amount of time in the library, and I would often work through the full textbook of a course that I might have in the first of the semester. But I never went to class.
So funny.
My GPA was not amazing. It was 3.64 or whatever. So 3.64 coming out of Florida, you weren't going to get in any place. I did have really good test scores. I think the GRE I had 2270 out of 2400, which would basically get you in any program. So I had the GRE set up, and I had nothing else going for my resume. So I had the idea that I could go to the London School of Economics for a year and do a very academic program there, and then maybe if I did well, I could get into a top program. And so that's what I did. So I went to LSE for a year, and that gave me the sort of credentialism that I needed to get into Harvard. So
Okay.
then I applied and got in.
We got in. That the unconventional route is also a success. Maybe even and sometimes more of a success. Like, why do you have to go the conventional route? I find it really funny that you like work through books. I and we're often at the library. Like, I would think that would be a tougher thing to do than to go to class. Personally, I would think going to class is the easiest thing. Well, if you're going to do something, or at least easy in comparison to working through the actual textbooks, because uh, when you're talking about complicated and very sophisticated subjects like behavioral economics and game theory, especially when taken seriously, I can just see working through these textbooks like not being an easy feat, at least at first, because I originally studied math myself until I realized I did not love math. So I gave up that. I was like, what am I going to do with this? Whatever. I switched to computer science, which was also not that easy, but it was a lot more interesting and fun than those classes. And yeah, I would I'm just surprised. It seems like counterintuitive that you work through the workbooks and not attend class.
Well, I'm a very visual learner. I learn with text, and I'm a bit ADD, but oddly, if you're a bit ADD, you can get sort of hyper focused on certain things. So sometimes if I'm reading a book that I'm interested in, I can get hyper focused for a long period of time.
Oh yeah, yeah, that's the benefit.
Um, and I found in-class learning to be almost impossible, or at least super inefficient. I just always felt I was just totally wasting my time relative to reading on my own.
So funny.
I just never did it. Even at the London School of Economics, my attendance rate was under 15%.
All right, well, I'm gonna have to call you out on something. And by the way, yeah, to allude to what I was, to repeat what I was saying earlier, the benefit of ADD is you can get super focused on something. That's many of these learning, would you call them disorders? Uh, actually have benefits. They have other sides of how how they're positive sides. Uh, well, before I call you out, I will also admit that I studied game theory myself a little bit. Too, I failed it twice. So this does seem to suggest that there's something wrong with the education system. Um, However, I find it really ironic that you barely went to class and you decided, you know what, I'm going to go again to school. Am I missing something here? Maybe I misunderstood you and you just decided this was a waste of time. So now I'm going to go to a very expensive school, Harvard, and continue my studies. Like, I don't really follow.
Well, I really enjoyed being around the college environment. That was
Okay.
for sure. I realized that that was sort of my favorite place to be. Kind of still is. Like, I always look for reasonable excuses. I've been teaching at University of Miami some recently. Um, I think college environments are just amazing, and people should cherish their time there, even college towns, right? And yeah, you could hang out in the college town and not engage in a curriculum, and that might have some benefits as well. Um, what I was doing was a doctorate program where it wasn't expensive because you were sort of on a program with a stipend and you did teaching and stuff like that. Um, and it was part of a track to maybe do that over the long term. I decided I didn't like research enough to do that. But I I love the academic environment, and I enjoyed teaching. I did not like attending class, or I did
Okay,
not like attending class all of the time.
okay, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I could see how college environments are really can be really inspiring places. Or actually, why don't you tell us what you love so much about them?
Yeah, I think that that age is a special age, right? It's sort of
Hmm.
your peak energy and intelligence, and also perhaps your peak flexibility, like lifestyle flexibility, if you will. Um, so it's a very inspiring time in life, and it's a time probably of the highest growth. Like you're developing very quickly. Um, so just to be around that, even if you're no longer in that stage of life yourself, is very inspiring.
Okay, okay. Yeah, I wonder if there's like a poker equivalent for people who are trying to learn poker. I guess people could have. It's definitely the case that people learn together much more effectively if that's what they're looking for. That sort of thing. That's one parallel that it seems to remind me of. But I do remember that the college life with all the social life and the people that are around um, can be it can you can create some really positive friendships and have a really great lifestyle.
Yeah, with poker, the concept of the poker house, right? That's like poker college. There have been some great poker houses that have developed a lot of top talents, right? You think
Mhm.
back to like the Durr Poker House with the Deng brothers and Benefield and even Galfond in there every once in a while. Like I think the concept of the poker house is like poker college. The thing is stress is bad for learning, right? That's
Yeah.
why one of the trends at places like Harvard that I'm very much against is they're always trying to pile more and more stuff into the curriculum and make
Oh,
things
this.
more stressful. And stress is bad for learning, right? We know this. The cortisol flooding your brain is terrible for your brain, it's terrible for learning, it's terrible for your body, right? And so the optimal learning environment has just the right amount of stress at just the right times, but really not too much stress. And poker is difficult because there's a lot of stress. And
Yeah.
if you really wanted the ideal poker college, like for 1 year, you would set it up where you had a lot of smart people that committed to studying the game very hard together, but somehow they committed to spending 75-80% of their time actually studying and discussing, and only 20% of their time playing, because the playing causes a lot of stress that hurts the learning.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I found as I've piled more and more things on my plate, that I was actually doing it too much. It was overwhelming me in a lot of ways. I did have the logic that, even though, and I noticed you wrote a book on being organized for the not so organized person. I was not fundamentally very organized, and that's probably a problem that a lot of poker players can relate to. Um, but I have the logic that, okay, well, all these hoops, these humps are sort of just things. They're just relatively humps. They can be things that can be um how do you say? They can be things that can be they what is stressful is relative in a way, in that like there's a lot of things that go on in your life, and the more that you push yourself, the more stress you can handle. Um, and I just figured all of them are humps, and I could just push myself through it, but it doesn't exactly work that way. I think there's truth to that side of things, but yeah, it's not healthy or effective to push too hard. I found is the kind of a frustrating thing. Um, I do want to talk about your books, by the way, because I am curious how you helped or decide or what sort of methods you had in dealing with not fundamentally being organized, because like I said, that's not a skill that really poker players need, and it might be one that a lot of them, especially if they're transitioning out of poker, uh, are or doing something out of poker. Like I know that your teacher uh, will have to learn to do something outside of poker.
Yeah, for sure. I'll just make one point on the stress thing, and then we can talk books.
Okay.
I think I think stress uh, is bad for learning and is bad for health. I think that in poker you have sort of conditioning and you have stress, and they're similar, but there are some differences. Like you've been conditioned in a way to loss, to risk, to volatility, because each time you've experienced volatility, the next time you experience the volatility is not so dramatic for your mind, right?
Yeah.
Um, so that makes it look like stress is good for you in the sense that you overcome things, but stress in the sense of something that's causing the fear response, something that's causing the adrenal response, something that's flooding your body with cortisol, like that's sort of always bad for you.
Right.
Uh,
Right. Okay.
so you want to minimize stress, but the conditioning that comes from experience makes it look like you have good stress resilience, or makes it look like stress is good for you, I guess.
Okay.
On the book side, um, yeah, I have 4 books. The bestseller is actually a poker novel that I wrote in 2005 called Broke, a Poker Novel.
Yeah.
Um, it was just random stories that I made up based on things that I observed happening around that time. And that was a lot of fun. I haven't read it to see how it's aged. I hope it's aged pretty well.
Mm.
It was a lot of fun to write. And I think that sold a decent number of copies, like somewhere in the 5 to 12,000 range.
Hmm. Oh wow, that's nice.
Then I have a couple of books. Well, I have a textbook for my course in behavioral finance that sold very few copies, maybe like 500 or 1,000. Then I have Setting Sun, which was a book on the U.S. economic situation in the mid 2010s. That sold a fair number of copies. I haven't looked at the figures. And then Personal Organization for Degenerates, which was out in 2017, which has sold a pretty fair number of copies, especially strangely enough in audio, where it sold I don't know, some thousands of copies. It was a very good guy that did the narration. His name is Mike Dawson, and he has a gravelly voice that suited the material well, and it sold pretty well on Audible. So it's about personal organization for people that have weaknesses or that struggle versus in their planning versus execution, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Because I would say that you have a concept in behavioral economics called hyperbolic discounting, right? Which
All right.
is
Well, I don't even know what that is. So whoever's watching is probably not going to know. So yeah, go ahead and explain.
it's it's that rational individuals, Homo economicus, behaves as if they have a discount rate for deferred consumption. And let's just say rationally that discount rate should be like 10% or 5%, right?
Yeah.
And so if I offer you more than that, you're willing to defer consumption, right? If I say, Dan, give me $1 today with 100% certainty you're going to get $1.20 in a year, you should do that because
Yeah. If it's
and
100%, I don't think it is, but okay.
And then lifestyle decisions are also a form of deferred consumption, or there's a form of discounting involved,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah, sure. I mean, you can do that with your time too, I presume, and all sorts of currencies.
yeah, I run on the treadmill and I hate it. Like I really do. I enjoy maybe 20% of the time, but often I'll have a goal for myself, like I'm gonna run 3 miles in this period of time.
Yeah.
And like I'm hating the last 6 or 10 minutes. Like I'm literally counting down the seconds. I'm really not enjoying it at all.
Oh yeah, yeah.
It's
Join the club. I'm sure. I don't think there's a long list of people that enjoy the treadmill. Man, if you could find a way to make people enjoy the treadmill, this is what Soul Cycle's about. This is why they do the Soul Cycle, right? Because it's like a bit more fun. Now there's music, and you're with a group of people, and that kind of thing. But yeah,
yeah,
go on.
the point is that it is if a form of deferred consumption. There are many things that you'd rather do with your time. And even eating, there are forms of discount rate, right? Like the salad is best, and you know that the dessert placed in front of you is not kind of worth it. And so the way humans actually seem to behave is that their long-term self, when they're making plans, uh, is a good discounter, a rational discounter. They make good decisions in terms of deferring consumption. But
Huh?
but then the short-term self, the one who's actually acting, when they get when they're presented with a weakness, something stimulating, they act as if their discount rate is absurdly high, like 100% annualized or more, right? And
Examples?
examples are like you go out to dinner, you go to Carbone, and you know that it would be a great experience to be with your friends and just keep it reasonable and have like a nice 1,500 calorie meal. But then the food actually arrives on the table and you act like you've never seen food before, and you have a 5,000 calorie vodka rigatoni plus full veal parm, and then the dessert comes and you have that too, right? And you leave with like 6,000 calorie meal that would take you
Whoops.
a month of exercise to work off. And with that, you've behaved as if your discount rate for time is like hundreds of percent annualized, right? Like you haven't the person who is actually acting in the short term was like unable to stay consistent with the long-term planner, right?
Sure, but
Um,
isn't that like the human condition? Like we're bad at making. That's why I was confused when you say uh, they make good long-term decisions. I was thinking, oh, really? I was thinking because like this in my mind is about the long term. Because if you can't make these decisions right, which literally no one does, then are you? I think I'm misunderstanding something. Maybe when the goal is really long term, that they appropriate the right amount of time, or I don't really follow the difference in like where are people making good decisions, because I thought that everyone was making bad decisions in these kinds of arenas. If that makes sense, they can't in the moment they lose track of the long term, is what I would have thought.
yes. Um, okay, so my book is for you, right? You have a sort of some degenerate qualities, which the title I probably could have come up with a better title. I thought it was funny at the time. It probably has turned people off. Maybe I need to come up with some new chapters and retitle it or something. But it it has, I will say, it has a nice quiet following. People mention it to me, and I think it's been a valuable book for many people that have some degenerate tendencies, right, which is a very large percentage of the poker community. So you say that you think all people behave this way. What I would say is that if you look at the popular books in organization, you look
Yeah.
at someone like David Allen or Tim Ferriss. I love him, but he's still guilty of basically assuming that the person is perfect all the
Oh,
time. Like they make long-term,
oh
like
yeah, yeah.
they're
I've
like
read some of these
machine
things.
like in their perfection in terms of execution. And
Yeah, it's
and
like, huh? Go ahead.
my point is that you need a more practical philosophy of organization. And I think in this short book, I do a good job of explaining my general philosophy. I also need to reread it because there are some important lessons that one tends to forget.
Yeah, that's one thing that really annoyed me about some of these books. Like one was called No Excuses, these self-help books, and I'm sitting here reading this like, what? You expect someone to read this book? And the guy would say, sugar is the root of all evil. And he's like, how many people do you know that have dropped sugar? I mean, American obesity is like plus like 40% or some insane amount of percent. And like, if people can't even do that, are they going to implement all those changes? And I mean, I don't know who's doing this. I guess like a very small percent of the population is capable of just reading a book and now saying, "Oh, okay, now I'm going to make all these changes." I don't think so. I don't think that's how it works, as you said. And I do think that the approaches are not very practical in actually helping a large audience. It's just kind of like, "Oh, this is what I do," or what I say I do, I should say, and then giving it to a lot of people. And yeah, I could see that absolutely true with Tim Ferriss. He's like, yeah, go follow your dreams and go get you can get the 4 hour work week. But I mean, it's a catchy title, but it's a long road to get there. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I was surprised at the success of Atomic Habits. I thought it was a good book, but it also sort of assumes perfection, right? It assumes,
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. I mean, they had some good ideas of how to change things. I mean, I think it's kind of obvious, for example, like if you're trying to like cut out all the bad stuff, don't keep fucking cookies in your pantry. I mean, you want to make it as hard as possible to get those cookies. Um, and I think some stuff like that is obvious, like stacking habits I find to be very difficult and that kind of thing. So I like the premise of what you're trying to do. It actually does seem like something that should be really built on. Um, I have I have ideas related to that. I want to talk a bit about some of your other books, um, and some of the other things that you're into. Uh, I know you teach game theory. I am curious how that, I've actually read the mathematics of poker. Let me tell you that. Well, why don't you tell me a little bit about your experience in teaching game theory and how does that actually relate to poker? It, yeah, go ahead.
well, game theory is the science of strategic interaction. Poker
Hmm.
has always been central to the study of game theory. I I don't know if the study of game theory improves your poker in any way, although um, I think that the development of modern poker theory would not have happened if not for uh, the science of game theory.
Okay.
Um,
Hmm.
so it can hurt, but it's it's not strictly necessary for the poker player, right? Um, However, like studying the science of strategic interaction, that seems to be kind of a good background for poker. And what I think is that when I read a good book about poker theory, my my background in game theory allows me to see uh, why the solution is the solution somewhat more quickly than if I hadn't studied game theory, right? Like I'm able to see when I observe a best response to best response solution to a particular problem, I'm able to, I think, see why the solution is the solution relatively quickly because I've seen other solutions of the type. Um, and when I read a book like, I don't know, a good no limit book, say Acevedo's Modern Poker Theory, or more recently when I was studying Heads Up PLO and I read Corey Mikesell's book on Heads Up PLO, I think the processing of a book like that is easier because I've seen the principles of game theory applied in other settings. And I enjoy it, right? Like I enjoy working through Corey's book and seeing the solution to a particular problem and thinking about why that solution is the solution.
Okay, okay. I can see a lot of what you're saying. Um, I do think like knowing a bit of game theory is useful. I don't find like going through the mathematics like particularly useful. I find it really challenging to do that and yeah, that kind of thing. But it is, I do find the solution or something like applied game theory interesting. And as you mentioned, or as I mentioned, excuse me, I failed game theory twice, is the funny thing. But I can see how it could be used, or how there's definitely like, I could see how because of game theory, poker game theory evolved. That makes a lot of sense. Uh, what does interest me
Well,
is
you're the computer science guy, so you might be able to explain this stuff a little better than I can. But
I,
um, the way the way I would explain it is that the science of game theory offered a way forward for solving games that turned out to be uh, not especially useful or not the best way to go. Um, and so the way that we solve games at the frontier now
yeah.
is uh, related to the science of game theory, but it's not exactly the science of game theory. Um, so if you watch a movie like AlphaGo about DeepMind's effort to beat Go, essentially they tell the story of how early on for chess engines and for Go engines, they used game trees and they sought solutions, game theoretic solutions to the problem, and that turned out to be not the best way to go relative to a computational solution where you lay out the objective function and then let the computer play against itself millions of times and converge upon a best response to best response solution.
You may have to translate that a little bit, but my interpretation is it sounds like to me you don't go purely from the theoretical route. It's better to actually go the experiential route, even for the computer, and just let it like iterate it and figure it out basically by like kind of stumbling in the dark would be the equivalent of like what a person might do for poker. Is that what you're trying to say?
Correct. That's exactly right. And it's still in that process, um, applying some game theoretic principles.
Okay.
So for instance, experientially, it is eliminating dominated nodes of the game tree, right?
Okay.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
that is sort of a game theoretic principle. You could also just say
Yeah.
it's a logical principle, but
It
it's
is. Well, it's
the
got
type
to be
of thing
both.
that, yeah.
By the way, this isn't like I don't know like a ton about this, but I know what that means. And for the viewers that don't know what the hell that we're talking about, this would be like this would be like an example in poker would be, you know, you decided to raise 10-8 offsuit from early position, and you've got enough sample that you realize, oh shit, this is a bad idea. Probably it's not a good idea to raise 10-8, 10-9 offsuit from early position, and you just like take away that that whole like strategy of like playing that. That would be like an extreme example of what you're talking about. But then I presume the computer does that more and more and more so, and does so at an insane level. Is that correct?
Yes.
I
Yes.
wasn't even 100% sure when I was explaining it. Um, by
And
the
then,
way,
like when you look at how they what the overall solution to the problem comes up with, like just let's say you observe that in a certain situation their bet sizing on the end is always pot in PLO, or it's always all in and no limit, even if
yeah,
all in is like a multiple of the pot.
yeah,
That is another situation of they've eliminated dominated branches of the tree,
yes,
right? It's
yeah,
just in that case, the dominated branch of the tree is something less than all in, right?
oh, yeah,
Because the all in is forcing better and better hands into indifference relative to the dominated nodes of the tree, and they're eliminating the dominated nodes.
this makes
Um,
sense to me.
it's
It's going
it's
to take
like
a
game
minute for.
theoretic. It's game theoretic principles, but it hasn't been come upon by the science of game theory. It's been come upon computationally. Um, to use an example from poker, okay, various overbets were uh, not especially common in the pre-solver era, right? You can read
Mhm.
through mathematics of poker and see why they make sense analytically, and perhaps if we had worked through things using the science of game theory, we would have gotten to the same place. Um, but we maybe got there earlier computationally. Another example is from the movie AlphaGo. The reason that they beat the human champion unexpectedly early is because they were often surprising the human champion with moves that they had never encountered before, right? And um, theoretically, maybe they could have come to those through just an extensive analysis of the game tree, right? But they probably got to them more quickly using the computational approach that they actually did,
From playing other players, you mean?
from having the computer play against itself tens of millions of times, subject to minimal,
I see.
right?
You're talking.
Like the way that we work through poker is um you can have the computer play against itself and converge best response to best response, subject to some tight constraints like bet sizing constraints and things like that, or you can have it play against itself subject to minimal constraints. And minimal constraints takes a long time, but maybe you're getting better solutions.
Okay. Uh, yeah, yeah. Um, I can see how. Yeah, I can see how. Well, I should say it's a bit surprising that that's the case, but that I would think that gives some kind of advantage over AI, and that it doesn't generally reach that. Well, apparently not in this case. Um, it's just interesting that it didn't get to that whole theme of an idea very easily. This idea of partitioning off the trees, even though it's like a simple idea and it just applies to everything. And I have an example myself of that may be useful for the audience to understand this a bit. I took a bit of a relative sort of strategy of partitioning off the trees for my limited Scrabble experience when I had to play a Scrabble match against you. Do you remember we had a high stakes Scrabble match in
Yeah, I remember
Australia?
that in Australia.
Yeah. So um, I was paired to play a Scrabble match with you with through Tony G somehow, and Tony G has some catchwords such as what is it? On your bike, and like some really simple words that were worth way more points than the typical words of Scrabble. They were worth like 50 points, and there was like one four-letter word like shot, or I forget what other goofy shit does he say, but I was sitting there thinking, there's no way I'm gonna beat this dude, this Harvard grad guy in a Scrabble. There's no way I'm gonna actually be better than this guy. So my whole strategy was around like thinking of combinations of getting these 50 word points that were like short. There's like one I think bike was one of the words. Bike was like 50 points all of a sudden in Scrabble. And so I was thinking, okay, uh how do I make it just bike, just put out bike or whatever and look for those kinds of combos of words. That was my strategy. To keep it really simple, I cut off all the other parts of looking for other kinds of words and looking for all these like convoluted words in general, these weird mix-ups. Um, I believe that applies, right? Like that was my relative I ignored all the other trees because they just weren't time efficient. And yes, a real strategy would have included those. But I just, with my limited Scrabble experience, this was like a relative way for me to playing the most optimal way that I could against you. Uh, does
Yeah,
that fit?
like a hack,
Yeah.
which is always a good way to proceed. By the way, I just want to say that I was all but dissertation in my doctoral program. So technically, I'm not a Harvard grad. You've said it a couple of times. So I just want to, I taught
Oh,
at Harvard for 9 years, but I didn't technically graduate because I was all but dissertation, meaning that I did all of the coursework but didn't finish the dissertation.
well, I would think that teaching at uh, Harvard for 9 years, how do you say it? uh, it supersedes the fact that you did not graduate. There's probably a lot more people that graduated that had no shot of teaching. 'Cause teaching is like a whole nother ball game. Like that's my point of view. I mean, graduating it by itself isn't like teaching is like a real world thing. Like to teach, you got to put together a curriculum. You have to public speak. You have to do all these things that a lot of people are just incapable of doing. Like period, or lack the courage or whatever to actually do. So the irony is, you've done something superior in my eyes than becoming a college graduate. This is like become a hard to get into Harvard is hard, but to actually graduate is probably like relatively not nearly as hard as actually getting in the first place. And even then, it's still like a commonly done thing.
I appreciate that. Certainly, if you don't like research and you're a little bit ADD, it's hard to get through the dissertation phase.
Yeah,
The
and
modern, hey,
dissertations are
the
hard to
modern
write.
form of teaching is podcasting. So now you're a podcaster. How are you liking it?
It's a good. No one's ever. No, people have asked me that a little bit. I'm liking it quite a bit. Uh, this was my way of trying to basically, in some way, I was trying to apply game theory actually to my whole life strategy, but I was failing in all sorts of ways. I still am not really 100% there, but this is a much more difficult subject. Um, I have a thought on that I want to ask you about, because I don't really. We'll get to that in a second. But I'm mostly liking it. Yeah, it kind of fits my personality in some ways. It also requires that it's like a soft push in the direction that I want to go in. I want to be a better person who's getting to know people, and in doing this, I'm getting to know you. I'm also building a connection with you. I also learning all of a sudden how to manage a team, which is what I want to do. It's like a cheap way to become like a leader of a team and practice those skills, and it's actually effective. It's like a real world motivator. It requires a small level of organization and commitment, things like that. So I actually am enjoying it, even though I'm not really succeeding in an extreme way anytime soon. It's good real world experience kind of thing. Um, it's this is me trying to effectively use what you were talking about, this method of like, I just think it's a better way to, from the game theoretical perspective of life, it's a better way to to try to satisfy multiple different objectives at once, and it forfeits a lot of inferior strategies, if that makes sense. It's like throwing myself into the fire a little bit, and also it's getting some, I guess you could say, some computations. Does this make sense?
Sure. You use the word succeeding. What does that mean? So for me, I really enjoy podcasts as a consumer.
Yeah.
I love to listen to podcasts. So for me, my podcast is like a small contribution to that ecosystem.
Yeah.
And it does cost a little bit to put out an episode. Maybe it costs a couple $100.
Yeah.
And I don't have advertising. So there is a spend of $200 plus my time, I guess. And it does make it sometimes a struggle for motivation, but I've kept it up for a few years now.
Yeah.
I question what does succeeding mean, right? Like
Succeeding means
what
like
is the objective?
succeeding in the sense of a very superficial way of looking at things. Let's put it like this. Because actually it's a good question. Uh, Succeeding meaning getting like 200,000 views, like that kind of thing, measuring it in that sense. And you're actually right. Is that
200,000 views per episode?
yeah, I'm nowhere near there.
Yeah, but do you
Uh,
realize how elite that would be in the world of podcasting? Like an elite podcast, a top 1% podcast would be one that consistently gets 10,000 views per episode.
really?
10,000. Yeah, that would be like an elite top 1% podcast.
Wow. Okay, I didn't realize like that's 1%. Okay.
Yeah, so you're comparing yourself to a universe of like the All In podcast or some big podcasts that are tens of thousands of dollars per episode. You can't compare yourself to stuff that's coming out as part of a podcast network where other podcasts are promoting them and things like this. Like 200,000 is in the stratosphere.
Okay. Oh, that's good to know because well, all right. This is actually a common theme of error that's happening a lot today is that people see like these like extreme variations of success. And they're like, oh, that's the norm. And I didn't realize it was like that far away from whatever. I mean, I didn't like put two and two together. I didn't realize, oh, like getting that kind of viewership is like well over 1%. I didn't know that. Interesting. But yeah, it's good to know. Yeah, it's succeeding in all the ways that I think it's meaning to. It's hard to like measure growth, but the real risk, it's actually like this is risk in practice. This is a test to try to basically grow as myself and make connections and provide some value and explore some new possibilities, and also to get people thinking about poker in a different kind of way. I'm going to talk a little bit about economics also. How does game theory relate to economics, or is this just like a totally? I mean, how different could it be? Like these topics seem like not that far away. Game theory, economics. I think there's like some kind. I know what utilitarianism which was an area that was interesting to me is a subset of economics. I don't actually, I think it is related to behavioral economics. But basically, what I'm asking is, how does all of what we're talking about relate to economics in your field of study? Is there like a direct crossover for you, or did you come about being interested in economics in another way?
So you have two branches. You have microeconomics and macroeconomics.
Yes.
Microeconomics is very mathematical, and I would say that game theory, the science of strategic interaction, is in microeconomics.
Yeah.
Whereas when people think about economics, they usually think in terms of macroeconomics, like inflation and GDP and unemployment and all of that type of stuff. So I would say game theory is very much a part of economics, but it's a part of microeconomics, individual choice, individual behavior, individual maximization according to preferences. And utility theory is part of microeconomics.
Yeah.
Utilitarianism is really branching into philosophy.
Oh, yeah.
It's Jeremy Bentham.
Yeah, I've read about his stuff a little.
It's a philosophy, but utility theory is central to microeconomics, right?
Right, right. Okay.
Microeconomics is about maximization of utility subject to constraints, where utility is defined for an individual. And when people talk about economics, they're often talking about macroeconomics, which is built up from microeconomic foundations, but often kind of gets far afield and gets very empirical, like what is the relationship between inflation and unemployment and these sorts of things.
Okay. That's a decent summary. It does sound very, very complicated on the whole. And I guess when we throw like philosophy and like maximizing one's life, which is essentially what utilitarianism attempts to do, I mean, ascribe getting comparing that to game theory and things like that is a little bit complicated, I would think. Although, why don't we just like put that to the side a bit and talk about your relationship with economics and game theory? What what's your focus exactly? I know you actually do write about macroeconomics. Were you like I know you researched for The Big Short, very famous film.
Well, yeah, I was the main research assistant for the book,
Oh, excuse me.
and then it did become a fun movie. I've always enjoyed economics research more on the macro side. I enjoy reading a lot about the macroeconomy, and I guess if you were to segment my podcasting interests, they're often in economics, finance, macroeconomics, politics. So that's an area where I do a lot of my reading. And I guess if you were to segment my podcast guests, maybe half are talking about economics and markets, 20% are talking about poker, and 30% are talking about something else.
Okay. It sounds like a very wide range of interests that's very daunting just for like how many areas of knowledge it's crossing over into, but it's also exciting for the same reason. Fear and excitement are actually quite related to each other. I do want to ask, how does game theory relate to your focus? Because you said that game theory more specifically relates to microeconomics, and I know that macroeconomics is more complicated because it's not so what's the word? It's not so linearly defined. It depends on multiple different like economics is complicated because it's an emergent system, is my understanding, and that it depends on many, many factors that are working together at once. So I'm curious, it seems like game theory kind of does focuses a bit on the opposite of that, which is like kind of taking a portion of reality and putting it like trying to like look at it as its like isolated piece, if that makes sense. Is this making sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely. But my experience in game theory is that I took a few grad courses in it when I was a grad student, and then I taught it to undergrads. But since then, I'm not active in game theory other than reading poker books and reading
Oh,
poker
okay,
content
okay.
and thinking about how game theory might be informing some of that content. So these days, my game theory is just strictly applied poker stuff.
Okay, okay, that does answer the question in an easy way. So it does sound like your economics interest is a little bit mm, it's not exactly exactly a byproduct of your interest in game theory. They're not like that related necessarily. It looks like they might have been related, but it sounds like it's just not. It sounds like it's just a fairly different subject for you.
Yeah, that's right. Like when you're doing econ grad school type courses, you have your first year courses, which are like microeconomic theory, macroeconomic theory, econometrics, and then you have your second year courses, and there
Okay.
you'll have some macroeconomics courses like international trade, international macroeconomics, and then you'll have some microeconomic courses like game theory,
Yeah.
right? And you kind of in the second year start to determine which of the elective courses are more interesting for you, and then you dive a little deeper. And for me, game theory was of interest when I was a grad student. Um, but it's not like I've had any ongoing research in that area. It was my progress sort of stopped after the teaching years, and then lately it's just for fun, if you will, just my applied work, my fun study in the poker streets.
Oh, okay, okay. Yeah, makes some kind of sense. Games are supposed to be fun, so story checks out. I have I have an idea that I've been pursuing. And unfortunately, well, I want to throw it out there, even though it looks like it's going to need some reframing of sorts related to economics of sorts. Um, One area of interest that has interested me is the idea of applying game theory to, and this would cross over to utilitarianism to a degree, applying game theory to social behavior, if that makes sense. Like in poker, you can see that certain behaviors are more beneficial on the whole uh, than other behaviors. And this actually relates to what we were talking about earlier, which was this idea that people are not so good at making like these short-term decisions when considering the long run, if that makes sense.
Right. I'm following.
Okay. Uh, so an example would be a perfect example would be you're playing poker, you just get sucked out on by the fish, and you say, "Damn it!" and get really mad, and you're frustrated, and you don't know where to point this anger, and you point it at the VIP. Uh, in my mind, this is like, well, first of all, it's gonna make the VIP or fish or whatever you want to call them not want to play against you in the future, which will hurt the game and you in the long run. In my mind, this is like the example that you gave me with the carbone dinner. You like somehow eat like $5,000 calorie or 5,000 calories, and it's gonna take you months to work that off. And so you basically forfeit. Your hunger got the best of you, and so now um, you forfeit the long-term goal for the sake of the short term. And in this case, it would be your anger getting the best of you, and you forfeit the long-term EV, even in a just a pure monetary perspective, not to mention happiness or like being liked, for example. Do you see where I'm going with this?
Yeah. My points of clarification are that you can be clear about your own preferences, right?
Yes.
So I can say, based on my own preferences, that if I go to Carbone and have the 6,000 calorie dinner, that is gluttonous, and that is me engaging in very short term behavior
Yeah.
that is not consistent with the way that I want to trade off things over time, right?
Yes. Yeah,
So
yeah.
I can say that that's hyperbolic discounting. That's giving into weakness on my part. That's something that I would like to change.
Yes.
Um, and there's a danger when you try to apply your preferences to say something about someone else's behavior,
Yeah,
because you don't know their preferences. So
I agree.
you can think that maybe if you did know their preferences, that might be uh, hyperbolic discounting or whatever, but you don't know for sure. So in the anger
Yes.
thing, I would say if you do it, then you can make a strong statement and say that that was a mistake by me. That's something I would like to change about myself.
Yes.
Right.
I see exactly what you're saying.
But you don't really, we can point out when someone else does it that's probably, but we can't say for sure, right? And I just want to say, you've talked about utilitarianism. It really does get into philosophy, because in economics, um, you really don't know others' preferences, right? We can try to
Yeah.
uh,
Well, people should.
we can try to say that someone is likely to have logical preferences. We can see how their preferences are revealed by their actual decisions over time.
Yes.
But it gets dangerous when you start assuming what other people's preferences are, right?
Sure.
And utilitarianism, it's a philosophy because it's sort of about the greatest utility for the greatest number.
Yes.
But it's historically been kind of a dangerous force because
Oh, yeah, yeah, I could see.
it leads to the concept of like the benevolent dictator, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it leads to this idea of someone deciding what's best for everyone and taking away human volition.
Right. Whereas you think about, say, the US economic system, and we might have fewer highways and not quite the nicest airports in the world, but we do a good job of catering to people's preferences, as strange as they are, right? Like
Yeah.
just walk down Las Vegas Boulevard and it's like, is it ideal that sort of our GDP is spent on lots of rich food and highly alcoholic drinks and fancy shows and multi-million dollar wastes of water and things like this? Like, is that the ideal use of resources? Maybe not, but it does a great job of satisfying people's preferences, as odd as they are, right? So
Yeah.
so microeconomics is about efficiently satisfying preferences, however weird those preferences might be, right?
Okay.
And so the danger of, say, utilitarianism as a philosophy is, there's always the temptation to say, oh, I know what your preferences should look like, so just listen to me and I'll do what's best for you.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I can see that for sure. This was a subtlety that took me a while to get over myself. I didn't value the I've come to look at the necessity of volition and ethics, the necessity of things to choose, for which I actually have a solution into even the game theory aspect in a way. I mean, yeah, you're right. Okay, theoretically, the guy who gets really angry at whoever they can that can be what they think they want, whatever, or that can be what they want, however you want to say it. Um, Related to all that, it's kind of like you get to related to the game theory aspect of things. You can still pick like who you hang out with and your actions and things like that. Uh, and then actually making change, there's only one way to change. People like that is just show by example. And that sort of thing. You can't really, you have to let them decide for themselves, essentially. You have to let people decide for themselves. Um, and yeah, that's an important aspect that's kind of almost paradoxical in game theory is like, how do you account for these sorts of, or not in game theory, but in social, like it, in maybe utilitarianism, or that would apply to the game theory of social behavior somehow, uh, if that makes sense. I mean, this is an
Yeah,
area
there
I'm,
is a whole aspect of game theory, like for instance, the concept of auction design is part of game theory, right? Or mechanism design where you want something to run smoothly and you need to accommodate many different individual incentives and preferences, and you want a structure where everyone sort of going by their own incentives is still making a workable whole uh, for the system, right?
yeah,
Like you think about Matt Savage, the problem he has, it's quite difficult, right? You have to run a tournament, come up with the right rules when everyone is narrowly maximizing. How do you come up with a cohesive structure and a great overall experience, right? He's the best. He figures out how to do it. They do an amazing job at the World Series, right? Like it's a tough problem, and
it is.
uh, the mechanism design can involve a little game theory.
Well, let's leave the audience with that, all those thoughts and all those sorts of things to ponder. We can't solve these problems today. It's been great having you on this show, Brandon. I've really enjoyed listening to your thoughts on many different areas. And yeah, I wish you the best success.
All right, sounds great. I'll chat with you later.